In historical context, the new imperialism characterized a period of colonial expansion by European powers, the United States and Japan, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The period featured an unprecedented pursuit of overseas territorial acquisitions. At the time, states focused on building their empires with new technological advances and developments, expanding their territory through conquest and exploiting the resources of the subjugated countries. During the era of new imperialism, the Western powers and Japan individually conquered most of all Africa and parts of Asia. The new wave of imperialism reflected ongoing rivalries among the great powers, the economic desire for new revolutions that market and the civilizing vision ethos. Many of the colonies established during this era gained independence during the era of decolonization that followed World War II. The qualifier "new" is used to differentiate modern imperialism from earlier imperial activity, such as formation of ancient empires and the so-called first wave of European colonization. Britain during the era. In Britain, the age of new imperialism marked a time for significant economic changes. Because the country was the first to industrialize, Britain was technologically ahead of many other countries throughout the majority of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, however, other countries such as Germany and the United States began to challenge Britain's technological economic power. After several decades of monopoly, the country was battling to maintain a dominant economic position, while the other powers became more involved in international markets. Social implications. New imperialism gave rise to the social views of colonialism. Rudyard Kipling, for instance, urged the U.S. to take up the white man's burden of bringing European civilization to the other peoples of the world, regardless of whether these other peoples wanted the civilizations or not. This part of the white man's burden explicites Britain's perceived attitude towards the colonization of other countries. While social Darwinism became popular throughout Western Europe and the US, the paternalistic French and Portuguese civilizing mission appealed to many European statesmen both in and outside France. Despite apparent benevolence existing, the notion of the white man's burden, the unintended consequences of imperialism might have greatly outweighed the potential benefits. Government became increasingly paternalistic at home and neglected the individual liberties of the citizens. Military spending expanded, usually leading to an imperial overreach, and imperialism created clans of ruling elites abroad that were brutal and corrupt, consolidating power through the imperial rents and invading social change and economic development that ran against their ambitions. Furthermore, nation building oftentimes created sentiments of racism and xenophobia. South Asia, India. In the 17th century, the British businessman arrived in India, and after taking a small portion of land from the East India Company, the British East Asia Company annexed most of the subcontinent of Asia, starting with Bengal in 1757 and ending with Punjab in 1849. Many Parsi states remained independent. This was aided by a power vacuum formed in the collapse of Mughal Empire in India and the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb and increased British force in India because of colonial conflicts with France. The invention of cheaper ships in the early 1880s cut the trip to India from Europe in half from 6 months to 3 months. Some Hindu and Muslim separatists rebelled in 1857, resulting in the Indian Rebellion. After this revolt was suppressed by the British and India came under the the direct control of the British Crown. The new administrative arrangement crowned the Queen Victoria's proclamation as Empress of India in 1876 effectively replaced the role of monopolistic enterprise with that of a trained civil service headed by the graduates of Britain's top universities. Southeast Asia, Indonesia. Formed colonization of the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, commenced at the dawn of the 19th century, where the Dutch states took possession of all Dutch East Indian Company or VOC assets. Before the time of the VOC, merchants were in principle another trading power among many establishing trading posts and settlements or colonies in strategic places around the archipelago. The Dutch gradually extended their sovereignty over most of the islands in the East Indies. The Dutch East Indies became the prized possession of the Dutch Empire. It was not a typical settler colony founded through massive immigration from the mother countries USA or Australia. It hardly involved displacement of the Polynesian islanders, with a notable and dramatic exception in the island of Banda during the Volk era. East Asia, China. In 1839, China found itself fighting the First Opium War with Great Britain after the Governor-General of Handu and Hubei, Lin Sizhu, seized the illegally traded opium. China was defeated, and in 1842 agreed to the provisions of the Treaty of Nanking. Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain, and certain ports, including Shanghai and Guangzhou, were open to British trade and residents. In 1856, Second Opium War broke out. The Chinese were again defeated and forced to the terms of the 1858 Treaty of Tianjin and 1860 Convention of Peking. The treaty opened new ports to trade and allowed foreigners to travel in their interior. Missionaries gained the right to propagate Christianity and other means of Western penetration. The US and Russia obtained the same propagators in separate trades. Central Asia. The Great Game, also called the Tournament of Shadows in Russia, was the strategic, economic, and political rivalry emanating the conflict between British Empire and the Russian Empire for supremacy in Central Asia at the expense of Afghanistan, Persia, and the Central Asian Khanates or Emirates. The classic Great Game period is generally regarded as running approximately from Russo-Persian Treaty of 1813 to the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, in which nations like Emirates and Bukhara fell. A less intensive phase followed the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, causing some trouble with Persia and Afghanistan until the mid-1920s. Africa. British colonies. Britain's firm occupation of Egypt in 1882, triggered by concerned zones. The Suez Canal contributed to a preoccupation over securing control of the Nile River, leading to the conquest of neighboring Sudan in 1896 to 1898, which in turn led to confrontation with the French military expedition at Fashoda in September 1899, or rather 1898. In 1899, Britain set out to complete its takeover of the future South Africa, which it had begun in 1814 with the annexation of the Cape Colony by invading the gold-rich Afrikaner republics of Transvaal and the neighboring Orange Free State. The chartered British South Africa Company had already seized the land to the north remained Rhodesia after its head, the Cape Tycoon Cecil Rhodes.